And gentlemen, my name is Nick Bartel, the editor-in-chief for Techno Warriors TV, and welcome to the very first episode of Conspiracy Corner. Conspiracy Corner is where we talk about all things taboo, different flat earth theories, the moon landing hoax, Planet X, the wormwood asteroid that's gonna come, all that sort of stuff we will talk on this segment. So I have BART SIBREL. BART SIBREL is a nationwide conspiracy theorist. He is the star of A Funniest Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. And that is a movie in where they actually disclose that the moon landing was a total cap. It didn't happen. The NASA decided to deceive everybody by putting all this trickery stuff in there, and he's going to tell you everything that happened because there's so much stuff to talk about. So without further ado, you should check out his YouTube channel. Check out his... Do you have a book?
Yeah, just go to my website, Sibrel, S as in Sam, I, B as in boy, R-E-L, Sibrel.com.
Okay, and I will link everything in the description where you can find his book, all of his movies that he's done. He has a truckload of information, everybody. And dude, it is super, super awesome to have you on the show. I am stoked. So I'm going to shut my trap and let you talk. So without further ado, it's time for the Conspiracy Corner with BART SIBREL, the moon landing hoax. We did not go to the moon.
Well, there you go. We're done. We didn't go to the moon.
So yeah, tell me about everything, how you got into everything, and how you found out the moon landing was total cap.
Well, back in 1969, I was 4 years old. I was asleep in bed. But my father was in the Air Force, and he was an officer, and he got a VIP package of 9x12 color prints from Apollo 11. So he gave them to me as a cherished gift, and I put them on my bedroom wall. So I had about 15 pictures from Apollo 11 on my bedroom wall that I saw every day from the age of 4 to 14. That's 3,650 times, believing they were real. And then when I was 14 years old, I saw a gentleman by the name of William Casey on television who worked for Rocketdyne, one of the contractors at NASA.
He made the Rocketdyne F1 engine.
Bill Casey worked for Rocketdyne, and he was an English major, and his job was to edit interdepartmental memos going from like the Pentagon to NASA, correcting the inexperienced grammar of top officials who may not have been as well educated, at least in English, as they were presenting themselves. So he would polish up their memos before they were received at the other party, Pentagon or NASA. In order to read such communique, he had very high security clearance, and he read from von Braun, stating in one of these memos that the likelihood of going to the moon for the very first time with untried 1960s technology was about only a 1 in 10,000 chance. So Bill Casey said what they did, like any good poker player who has garbage, they bluffed. They pretended they could go when they could not.
So, sorry for interrupting, that rocket could not do it. So it really couldn't do what it could?
Well, it could achieve Earth orbit, which they had done previously with Mercury and Gemini flights. However, here we are 50 years later, and the farthest that NASA can send an astronaut into space is the same as back then, Earth orbit. You see, that's why the Artemis rocket that's allegedly orbiting the moon is doing so with mannequins, because humans cannot survive to this day a trip to the moon. Otherwise, they would be taking pictures out the window as they orbited the moon, right?
Yeah.
So it is kind of odd they could send humans walking on the moon with untried 1960s technology, and yet today, with 5 decades better technology, they have to send mannequins to orbit the moon. You see?
That is so weird. That's so sus. Like, the moon landings back then, and like, if they didn't know, they would have it on Twitch, on YouTube, on TikTok, on Facebook, on Twitter. They'd be streaming it everywhere. What's up, dudes? We're on the moon. But guess what? All we got were just, like, potato video quality. All the 60s people got was potato quality footage. Like, I mean, a traffic light camera took better pictures than what everybody saw with the moon landing.
Yeah, I mean, Gilligan's Island found it worthy in, I guess, 1966 to go from black and white to color. Yet, for some reason, I guess Gilligan's Island had better technology than NASA did, because they only showed black and white pictures from the surface of the moon when they could have showed color, but they didn't want to show high resolution because it would give away the fact that they were really on Earth. And so when Bill Casey said that on television, when I witnessed it as a 14-year-old, I went back to my bedroom after the program and started looking critically at those pictures. And sure enough, you could see, if you look closely, where the real soil surface ends and where a fake backdrop begins. In a lot of pictures, a pretty straight line going across horizontally left to right. So that kind of planted a seed in my mind. I wonder if they really went to the moon. Fast forward another 10 years, 24 years of age at this point, and I'd become a filmmaker. And one of my clients was the producer of the show I saw with Bill Casey on it 10 years earlier. He put me in touch with Bill Casey, who, as a filmmaker, suggested that I make a documentary about the moon landings being falsified. So I said, well, let me think about it. And I took off about 6 months and did some preliminary investigation. And there were a lot of things that were highly suspicious. Shadows that they claim are, from sunlight intersect at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart, which is impossible in sunlight. Just go outside during the day with a friend and stand 5 feet apart out in a parking lot or yard on a sunny, cloudless day, and your shadow and your friend's shadow always run parallel and never intersect. But they intersect, the shadows do, multiple times from objects 5 feet apart, as much as 90 degrees, which means that's not sunlight, it's electrical light, which means they're on Earth. So you can really prove that the moon landings are fake with one picture of shadows intersecting at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart, which you can view for free at Sibrel, SIBREL.com. And then we have the fact that today they can only send astronauts 1,000th the distance to the moon. So what they're really saying is, when all of NASA combined had 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone, they sent astronauts 1,000 times farther than they can today, which would mean that technology was greater in the past than in the future. But that's a scientific and historic impossibility. It's not possible for technology to be greater 50 years ago than today, but that's what it is. So how can that be? Well, it can't be, which means it's a forgery. So you can prove it with that. And then in the process of producing this film, a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, which was financed by a board member of an aerospace company who builds rockets for NASA. Who
That
knows
is
it's
so
fake.
fire.
Yeah, he gave us $1 million
NASA?
to prove it. And in the course of producing this film, we uncovered classified footage of fake photography of them faking being halfway to the moon with a 1-foot model of the Earth allegedly floating in space, which is a complete forgery. And even my critics agree it's a forgery. They just say, well, they were just rehearsing. Well, I'm like, well, then you would rehearse with the real Earth out the window and wouldn't make a 1-foot model fake one, So, and then my book, which is at Sibrel.com, which just came out. It's in audio. I read it myself. It's also Kindle and print. We have the confession of Cyrus Eugene Akers, who was the chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968. And on his deathbed, he confessed he stood beside President Johnson while they filmed the first fake moon landing at his military base a year in advance. President Johnson gave him a list of 15 people who were allowed to come in and eyewitness the faking of the moon landing, and he gave that list to me. That's published in the book, and some of these people are still alive. So we have 4, conclusive proofs that they didn't go to the moon. Shadows intersecting at 90 degrees, classified footage that proves to be a 1-foot model of the Earth. We have the logic that you can't have 1,000 times greater space traveling capability in 1969 than you do today. And then we have an eyewitness account who was there while they filmed the faking of the moon landing at Cannon Air Force Base at Clovis, New Mexico. Now, my father was in the Air Force, and I'd never heard of Cannon Air Force Base. I looked it up on Google Maps. It's tiny, which is great because that's fewer eyewitnesses. And secondly, the intelligence, headquarters, the CIA, if you will, of the United States Air Force, guess where it's located? At Cannon Air Force Base.
I thought it'd be Area 51.
Well, no, it's at Cannon Air Force Base is where the special ops of the Air Force is located. So that's exactly where they filmed the fake moon landing in a large airplane hangar and brought in tons and tons of pulverized concrete to mimic the powdery surface of the moon. So all this is in my book, Moon Man, which you can get at sibrel.com, and it's an interactive book. There are 16 video links, which you can see for free right now. And basically, I write a chapter and say, now stop, go to sibrel.com, watch Moon Man book link number 1, so you'll know what I'm talking about. One of those links is the film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, that showcases the classified footage of fake photography right in front of your eyes, and Astronauts Gone Wild, where I confronted several of the astronauts a couple of years after the first film, asking them to swear on the Bible, at which point one person kicked me, punched me, and then we found a secret recording of one of the astronauts and his son plotting my assassination with the CIA or by the CIA, which of course would not be necessary if they really went to the moon and I'm some silly person who thinks otherwise. So unfortunately, the moon landings were indeed falsified, and that's just the way that it is. And because it's such an emotionally charged topic, some people refuse to accept the fact that their government is corrupt enough to fake the moon landing, and they certainly are, and they've done worse things than that as well, which I talk a little bit about in the book. According to one of the surviving widows of the Apollo astronauts, her husband was murdered by the CIA because he wouldn't participate in corruption at NASA. Not my opinion, that's the opinion of the dead Apollo astronaut's wife, who spoke to me for 4 hours. Wow. So that's one of the chapters in the book, and it basically discloses homicides that the CIA committed against Apollo astronauts because they would not cooperate with faking of the moon landing. So it's not my opinion that these Apollo astronauts were murdered by the CIA. It's their dead relatives who say so. So that's pretty serious.
Question. I got a question for you. So the Aerojet Rocketdyne F1 engine produces what, about 1.8 million pounds of thrust? And yet the Gemini spacecraft using the Titan II missile, that thing can get in a high altitude orbit, because I tried that in Spaceflight Simulator and Kerbal Space Program. Yet I tried to launch a Saturn V in KSP and SFS, and you can barely get it into lunar orbit, or you can get it into lunar orbit, but it's kind of hard to. Yet, how could they do that? And let me tell you this: the engines for the Gemini era and Mercury era, they were horrible. You kept having ruds, or basically the rocket blows up or the engine blows up, like unscheduled disassembly, rapid unscheduled disassembly. Yet, how could the Apollo Saturn V, which is 363 feet tall, produces 8.8 million pounds of thrust, launch the first time perfectly on its first go and not explode? Yeah, they sent astronauts on it on Apollo's it was Apollo 8. They sent the first astronauts, but I watched another documentary that talked about the moon landing as well. But guess what? They said they didn't go all the way up. They didn't go into the rocket at all. They came back down in the elevator because they didn't want to risk the astronauts' lives. Is that correct?
You're talking about which rocket did they not want to risk their lives?
The Saturn V, the big giant one.
Well, they had humans on board. They just never left Earth orbit, and that is proven by the footage we uncovered of the crew of Apollo 11 pretending to be halfway to the moon from Earth orbit. It's slated by a digital clock stamp 2 days into the flight, where they're supposed to be halfway to the moon. And in the part that they did well of the fake footage, they claimed to be halfway to the moon. But the lights come up and you see that they have faked a 1-foot model of the Earth as if it's floating in space from Earth orbit. And so it proves that the Saturn V equipment could not leave Earth orbit. And what a surprise, here we are 50 years later, and they've never left Earth orbit with a human. And then one of the clips at sibrel.com, just go there and click on the top left button that says Moon Man Book Links. And you'll see Kelly Smith, an employee of NASA, admitting on camera that the technology required for an astronaut to leave Earth orbit on a trip to the moon has yet to be invented. So if the technology does not yet exist, as NASA said through one of their own employees, if it has yet to be built today, then how could they go to the moon in 1969 with 1/millionth the computing power of a cell phone? I mean, that's why there's mannequins on board the Artemis. It doesn't make sense that they could send humans to the moon 50 years ago, and then 50 years later, they can only send mannequins to the moon. I mean, come on.
No, that's so sus.
I mean, how much more proof do you need that the moon landing is fake, right, Nick?
Yeah, I know. It's like, okay, the moon landing was total cap. It didn't happen. And it's like no cap. The moon landings are totally faked. Another thing that I saw is why is the flag waving when there's no air on the moon? That is so weird. There's no air on the moon, yet it's waving like it's in the wind. Did you see that too?
Well, yeah, I mean, they were on Earth and they had on spacesuits and they couldn't put the cooling units in them because in Earth gravity, they would fall over backwards. So sometimes they held them up by cables, which they painted black. And they basically had to have a lot of air conditioning in that hangar to keep whoever was in those suits cool. And occasionally it caused some wind turbulence in the flag. I mean, there's so many proofs that they didn't go to the moon. And a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, which you can see for free at sibrel.com. We show them allegedly bouncing around on the moon in the original TV pictures, and I simply doubled the speed. And you see very clearly that they're simply using slow motion. They should be getting 6 feet off the ground in 1/6 gravity. But in fact, they're only getting an inch off the ground. And when you double the speed, it's like, oh, they're on Earth and they were using slow motion to fake us out. I mean, slow motion looked very convincing until you have professional equipment that can double the speed and you see, oh, that's the real, speed right there. And they're just barely skirting an inch above the surface. And there's so many proofs that they didn't go to the moon. Unfortunately, it's so emotional to people that they say it's blasphemous to say that the great and glorious moon landings are fake. They shouldn't be mad at the messenger. They should be mad at their government who took their money to deceive them and then used it to murder their own fellow citizens who were trying to expose their crimes. And because these people and these entities are still at large running the show, that's a very dangerous thing to have a government that fakes the moon landing, kills Kennedy because they don't like him, and according to 3,000 architects and engineers, did 9/11. Not my opinion. That's the opinion of 3,000 architects and engineers say that it must have been the U.S. government that brought down the World Trade Center. So they're murdering their own people, and they're doing who knows what else, deceiving us continually through propaganda. That this is a dangerous state of affairs for our country and for the world when this is the allegedly, world leader that claims to be so righteous when they're so incredibly corrupt.
And one thing, and it's like super sad that you even see all the astronauts. Like when I watch the show, Astronauts Gone Wild. I mean, even okay, there's an episode where we're interviewing Al Bean, right, about when he went to the moon, right? It's like, now if you pay attention, he says like 20 times in the interview. I'm like, can you just say it once? Like, I don't know why he had to say, he kept repeating himself and repeating himself and repeating himself to get you to think that it was real.
Yeah, he admitted accidentally that he did not leave Earth orbit. He said he did not go through the Van Allen radiation belt, which is true. And then when I reminded him, you had to leave Earth orbit to go to the moon, he goes, oh, then I guess we did. It's pretty odd. And one person says when the rocket was descending to the moon's surface, it was very loud. And another astronaut on another mission with the identical equipment descending to the moon, he said was, perfectly quiet. Because during the recordings from Apollo 11, when they're allegedly descending to the moon's surface, it's no engine noise in the background whatsoever, because the voice was done live from Earth orbit where the engines weren't burning at all. So one astronaut says it was quiet. Another person says, oh, it's very loud, vibrating noise when you're descending. Another issue is, can you land a rocket vertically like they claim to have done in 1969? Now, Elon Musk had 6 million times greater computing power than the Apollo program. And the first 4 times he attempted to land a rocket vertically with 6 million times more computing power, it blew up 4 times in a row. So it's interesting that with 50 years better technology, the first 4 attempts blow up trying to land a rocket vertically. But somehow with 1, millionth and then 6 times again smaller computers, they could land a rocket vertically the first time they tried.
No, it's like my Alexa. It's like my Alexa, my Echo Dot that's on my bed, like on the top of my bed. That has more computing power than the Loon Lander says it has. So go ahead.
This is why they destroyed all the electronic diagrams and hardware diagrams of the allegedly miraculous Apollo equipment, which is kind of odd that you would spend what today would be an equivalent of $200 billion and then throw all that investment, the hardware, the blueprints, the schematics, and destroy them intentionally, which is what they
everything?
They did. According to Don Pennant, they deliberately destroyed, he's an astronaut at NASA, he said they deliberately destroyed all of the moon technology. Now, why would you do that? I mean, maybe you should have done that with the atomic bomb after you killed people at the end of World War II. Hey, why don't we just, throw the technology away so no one does such a horrific thing again? But just 10 years later, atomic bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. So if they really went to the moon and spent an equivalent of $200 billion to do it, you would never throw all that equipment and designs away. You would throw it all away if you perpetrated a fraud, and it could be proven electronically or fuel-wise you couldn't actually go to the moon. So the fact that they destroyed all the evidence of going to the moon is proof of the fraud. Because if you really went, you would never do that. If you perpetrated a fraud, that's exactly what you would do. So that's proof itself that they didn't go. And they destroyed all the original videotapes, all the original telemetry as to where the rocket really was, which is pretty remarkable, isn't it? When you think they would preserve it, right?
Now, one thing is, you remember the Challenger accident, right? Really super sad. What is your opinion on the Challenger accident?
Well, I mean, my opinion is that they didn't follow their own protocol. I think they had a protocol of not launching if it got like below 45 degrees or something like that the previous night, and it got down to like 43 degrees. And so there was it was 2 degrees or so below what they said should be the, the line that they would scrub and reschedule. But they had already scrubbed 2 or 3 times before, and it was so close, just a couple of degrees difference, and they went ahead and did it, and I guess that caused a catastrophic failure.
And it's like, that's super sad. It's happened twice. And then we had Columbia, and it's like, grr, can't you get this message, NASA? Please be safer with your astronauts. Do you not even care about them?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that they've killed people just orbiting the Earth, but somehow traveling to another world and basically having 2 separate flights, one off the Earth and one off the moon. That never killed anybody. Kind of interesting. And so what can you do? The federal government lies, and they lied about the greatest accomplishment of mankind. And you can go to sibrel.com and watch these films if anything happened on the way to the moon for free.
And that's
you
really
can
cool.
see all of this. Yeah.
And you can see everything, guys. You can see how they faked the moon landing. And if you look really closely on that the classified image. Like, there's actually like a human hair. There's like a mic muffler, a mic fluff thing that actually gets away in the camera. And you can, when they're trying to fake the moon landing, so they're taking being like, well, what, like, you know, what, 2,000, like third of the way there, second of the way there, but they accidentally put the mic muffler in the view of the camera, so you know that wasn't taken in orbit. I mean, they weren't just vibing on like in Earth orbit like they're on the ISS. They say, oh my God, look at we're 200,000 miles away from Earth. We're almost to the moon. Let's go. That's a bunch of BS. You are in looping around the moon. You are just making it so, like, your camera is like this, and you put the, what, you said they had a model of the Earth, like a 1 foot model?
Well, they were in Earth orbit, and they had a circular window that had the Earth outside of it. And Earth shine is very, very bright. It's like a bright, you know, it's like the sun pretty much blaring through the window. So they used a circular window to pretend that that was the Earth floating in space. They turned out the spacecraft lights and all that is in. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. You'd see how they faked it. And we have a third track of audio from the CIA, who's telling them not to answer NASA's radio communications immediately because it would give away the fact that you're really close to the Earth. Instead, the CIA prompts them to count off 4 seconds. First, we hear the CIA count off 4 seconds, say talk, and then Neil Armstrong speaks only after he was given the cue by the CIA after a fake 4-second radio delay. All that is clearly on the tape too. So it's really remarkable. That's what convinced me. I was producing the film under the theory it might be true that they faked it. And then when I popped in a tape that said, do not show to the public as at the lead of the film, and it's the same shot for like an hour of a special effect, and the lights come up and you see it's a 1 foot model of the Earth that they claimed was floating in space halfway to the moon. And then you have a third track of audio of the CIA, you know, telling them to fake a radio delay. There's not much more you could say other than they were on the rocket, but they never left Earth orbit. And that's why the Artemis rocket today has mannequins on it, because they cannot leave Earth orbit 50 years later with the human on board. Otherwise, there'd be humans orbiting the moon on the Artemis rocket. So if they cannot put humans on a rocket to the moon today, then how could they possibly have done it with 1960s technology when no one had ever tried it before? You see,
And
it's
then
illogical.
another thing is with Artemis 1 and the Space Launch System, Orion was uncrewed, the first one. It just splashed down a couple weeks ago. But the thing is, they even said in like early promo reels for Orion that we have to see how people can handle the radiation belt before we send people to the moon. And I'm like, yeah, we didn't go.
Yeah, I mean, they sent up a spacecraft into the radiation belt, which most people don't even know exists. It's this thick, 30,000 mile thick radiation field that doesn't start until about 1,000 miles above the Earth. So every manned mission, Gemini, Mercury, Space Shuttle, the space station, is well below the radiation field, except going to the moon, you'd have to go through it. And that's why Kelly Smith said the technology to go through that radiation and survive has yet to be invented, which means they didn't go to the moon. That's what it means. And so they sent up the unmanned Orion spacecraft that you're talking about with 2 Geiger counters on board to measure the radiation. And when I asked NASA for those Geiger counter readings, they refused to give them to me. They said it was a military secret. And I'm like, well, why should a part of nature be a military secret? That's like saying the temperature of the sun is a military secret, or the amount of helium in Jupiter's atmosphere is a military secret. There's no reason.
Oh, the flowers are a secret. You can't touch them. You can't look at them.
Yeah, so they don't want to show the Geiger counter readings of the radiation belt because it proves that the astronauts, you know, would die in the Apollo spacecraft if they went through it. And again, Kelly Smith says out of his own mouth, the radiation field is dangerous, and the technology for an astronaut to go through it and survive on a trip to the moon has yet to be invented. So they don't have the technology to travel to the moon, and that's why there's mannequins on board the Artemis rocket. And that's why Kelly Smith said the astronauts can't go through it until we, invent how to do it. Right?
And
So,
yeah,
so
and
that
it's
means
like,
that
and it's
they
like
didn't go to the
it's
moon.
like they
That's
didn't
what
go to
that
the
means.
moon at all. So it's
Yeah.
like Buzz Aldrin lied, Neil Armstrong lied, who else lied? Al Bean lied. Who else? All of them lied. But the freakiest thing was the Apollo 1 fire. Super sad. They had so many problems with that spacecraft. And I've seen footage and everything of the Apollo 1 fire and the soundtrack from it. I mean, that was like total malicious. That was a freak. I think that was deliberate because who was the guys on there? Like what was it? I think there were three astronauts. Gus Grissom was one of them, and he wasn't Gus Grissom the most like critical and stuff, or was it?
Yeah, I mean, the second to the last chapter of my book is called NASA's Greatest Fear, and which is if they faked the moon landing and did not kill a single person in the process, it's still a bad thing to do, but at least it's just a forgery. The problem is that they murdered, several people to keep the moon landing fraud a secret. Now, the man who was going to be the first man to walk on the moon was Virgil Gus Grissom. And he was the most beloved of all the astronauts by the public and by the press corps. That's why they picked him for Apollo 1 to be the first one to go to the moon. The day before he died in a contrived accident, he told his wife, Betty Grissom, who I interviewed for 4 hours. He said, "Hon, for some strange reason, the CIA was all over the launch pad today, and I've never seen them there before. I wonder why they're there today." The very next day, the guy's dead. So I think the CIA had something to do with it. That's Betty Grissom's own testimony, that the CIA murdered her husband, who would have been the first man to walk on the moon. So the CIA is using our tax dollars to fake moon landings and then to murder people who try to expose it. That's criminal. That's a felony.
That's a
treason.
murder, dude. That's treason.
And so why isn't anybody doing anything about this? Because the heads of all the departments that are supposed to investigate this are appointed by corrupt presidents who are murderers themselves. Talk about election interference. I think killing Kennedy is election interference because according to Bobby Kennedy Jr., the dead man's nephew, who has more access to the Kennedy assassination files than anyone on earth other than the CIA, he says he's 100% certain that the CIA murdered John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the president of the United States, because he was anti-corruption. So I think you could call that election interference because he was elected and the CIA says, well, we don't like him, so we're going to kill him.
What?
So that's what the CIA did. And they're still in business. I don't understand how that could be. How could it be that it's a known fact that a company is murdering their own employees and no one does anything about it? That's how corrupt our government is.
That's not cool.
So, and these same people are in charge today, and their apprentices and their ideology is still alive and at work in our government today. Otherwise, they tell the truth that the moon landings were fake. Otherwise, they tell the truth that 9/11 was not done by airplanes. Otherwise, they wouldn't do other things, you see. That's why they're so insistent on defending the very weak structure of the moon landing, claim of 1969, when NASA has never kept a schedule except the most complicated mission of all time. And so if it takes like 4 attempts to reach the South Pole on Earth, and NASA can't even orbit the moon on schedule with mannequins 50 years later, then how could they possibly do the most complicated mission of all time ahead of schedule, you see?
Yeah.
And so this lying government is in charge today. And what else are they doing? What other lies are they telling? Just because something is in every newspaper and on every TV does not mean it's true. All you have to do is look at the moon landing fraud for one, or the Kennedy assassination. I have a clip. It's at Sibrel.com. It's Moon Man clip, I think 14 or something, where we showed Dan Rather saying, "Let me describe the Zapruder film to you because we're not going to show it." And he says, and then the second, gunshot is heard, and the president's head goes violently forward when it's going violently back. So he tells the exact opposite of the truth to the American public, because if his head is going back, that means the shot came from the front when Oswald was allegedly behind him. So we have him right there on camera synchronizing Dan Rather's lie with the Zapruder film, where you see he's telling the American public the exact opposite of the truth. So that's what they're doing constantly. The news media is run by the CIA, and they very regularly say the exact opposite of the truth all the time, nonstop.
That is, oh my God, that is like super eye-opening. So there you guys have it, ladies and gentlemen. The moon landing was straight cat. It did not happen. We didn't go. Sayonara. So I want to thank BART SIBREL for being on our show today. Awesome to have you on. Be sure to check out his website, BART SIBREL, where you can check out Moon Man, you can check out his book, you could check out A Funny Thing that Happened on the Way to the Moon, Astronauts Gone Wild. You could see and this thing goes in depth. You'll be reading this stuff for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and it's like, oh my God, the moon landing was total cap. It didn't happen. So
the website is just my last name, Sibrel, S as in Sam, I, B as in boy, REL, Sibrel.com, and you can see everything there for free.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, if you like this video, you know what to do. You hit that like button if you like this video. Hit that dislike button if you think the moon landings were real. And if you adored it, all you have to do is strangle that subscribe button, slap it in the face, and pow! Right in the kisser! Have an awesome day, ladies and gentlemen. Okay.